Well, I've got 6 o'clock. We may have a few people joining us, but why don't we go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Wanberg. I'm the city planner here in Faribault, and I'm pleased to have Scott Riggs, our city attorney, with us. We'll go through some introductions in just a moment, but I want to give you a little background on this. Oh, let me also turn the transcripts on. So I again want to thank you. It's a beautiful night, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We do have an opportunity to have questions and answers throughout our meeting here tonight with Scott Riggs. We'll try to go through this as quickly and efficiently as we can. But, Scott will tell you, yeah, absolutely feel free to ask questions anytime. We do have a PowerPoint presentation. So if you want to mute yourself for now, but then when the presentation starts, if you have questions, just go ahead and ask those questions and we'll get them in. Otherwise, you can feel free to put them in the chat box. With that, Scott, what do you think? Go ahead and just start with some introductions to get an idea of who we have on what board and committee.
Yeah.
So why don't we just go around and why don't let's see, I've got a number of people up on the screen. So I will just call the names I see on the screen, but I'm not sure that every name applies to the person on the screen. So I will start out with that, and you can just unmute yourself and tell us who you are and what board or commission you're on. We'll start out with Holly and then move to Chuck Ackman.
Hi, my name is Lee Nordmeyer. I'm part of the HPC committee. Just obviously using my wife's computer. Thank you.
Chuck?
I'm Chuck Ackman. I'm chair of the Planning Commission and chair of the Charter Commission.
And Dick Houston and Sam Temple then.
I'm part of the Environmental Commission. Dick Houston.
I'm Sam Temple. I'm on the Planning and Heritage Preservation Commissions.
And David Sauer and Paul Panoski.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Sauer. I'm on the Historic Preservation Commission. Thanks.
And I'm Paul Panoski. I am the Parks and Recreation Director. So I'm on a number of things.
And Cindy, and then Corey.
I'm Cindy Diesner and a member of the Environment Commission.
And I'm Corey Weems, and I am on the Historical Preservation Committee.
Then Emily and Sally.
I'm Emily Nesvold, and I'm a member of the Environmental Commission.
And I'm Sally Kramer, and I'm on the Park and Rec Board.
And Chad and Carl.
Hello, I'm Chad Kreger. I'm the current chair of the Parks and Rec Board.
I'm Carl Voss, and I'm on HPC.
Then Roger and Deanna.
I'm Roger, and I'm the chair of the Environmental Commission.
And I'm Deanna Kennan. I'm the Community and Economic Development Director.
We have Lola and Sunny.
Hi, I'm Lola Brand. I'm on the Park and Rec Advisory Board.
And Sunny, do you have an interpreter on if you have questions? You can use the chat box if you'd like as well. And then Travis.
Hi. Travis Davidson, let's see, chair of library board. I almost had to think about it there for a second.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. So we have a number of people on. Why don't we just go ahead and turn it over to Scott. And Scott, so if you want to mute yourself until you have some questions, and Scott will go through this, but we do encourage you to ask questions along the way.
All right, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'm Scott Riggs. I'm the city attorney for Faribault. Been the city attorney, I think since 2003, I think it is. So it's been a little while. We have not done a broad type commission. I don't want to call it education, but just kind of information session for quite some time. We've done it with some of the other boards like the HRA and the EDA, but city administration, Tim Murray and other staff, you've got Deanna and Paul on here along with David, have been talking about we should do this and just update some folks. We've got some parameters and ideas of what's out there, what you may be involved in, and honestly, some of the pitfalls you should be aware of to be careful about. And at any time, please.
I don't feel like at your guys' age, I should still be having to harp on this. So I'm going to draw out here one more time. We're going to go into our last tournament here this spring. And we're just going to expect.
Okay, there we go. And at any time you have a question, please stop me. I'm going to try to go through this. I think I've only got 17 or 18 slides. It looks like more than it really is. But Dave, why don't you put the PowerPoint up and let's jump into it.
Are you seeing it, Scott?
You can go to the next one. Yeah, when you're ready, you can go to the next one. I have it. Hopefully everybody else has it as well. I just have a list here of the topics that kind of I want to touch on and Dave wanted me to touch on, which really are the open meeting law, data practices, gift law, conflicts of interest, and then kind of procedural basics for parliamentary procedure, and then social media issues, which are, these are mainly the hot topics that you're going to see and become involved in if you have an issue or a question that's sort of outside the normal boundaries of what your board or commission may be dealing with. You can go to the next slide, Dave. First thing I'll just touch on is kind of the role of what the commission or a commission member is. And again, keep in mind, there's a broad basis of who's on the call tonight, but the reality is you all kind of fall under the same category of being advisory to the council. You're appointed by the council, and you're really there to help decision-making and policy level decisions at the council level. And you also have staff liaisons there to help you with that. But again, the basic tenet of what you do is advise and help the city council come to policy decisions, since they are the 7 members of the city that do that for everybody. You also end up serving as ambassadors when you're appointed to city commissions, and are kind of the folks that are looked to as being the movers and shakers in the community, and who others look to for guidance on what the community is doing or roles in the community. So I do commend you for serving. I think that's a great thing that people undertake in doing civic duty. So if there's anything I can do, or Dave or any of the other staff on the call can do to help you perform your duties, please let us know. Dave, you want to go to the next one? First topic I'll touch on very quickly is open meeting law. I think most of you know, but the reality is any meeting that you have as a commission must be open to the public. And what is a meeting? It really is when you have a quorum of the commission members present that are receiving or somehow deciding or discussing information related to city business or your board's business. It doesn't mean you actually have to take action. So a work session like the city council does at least once a month, they're not really making decisions there, and you may not be making decisions at your meetings. It still constitutes a meeting that we have to track, publicly notice, and allow the public to participate in. It does not include, it usually does not include the next 2 items on this list: chance or social gatherings at a restaurant, something along those lines, or seminars and conferences, things like that. But it can get to that point. If there's a 5-member board and you have 3 members that go to a conference or seminar, or somehow come into contact with each other at a restaurant, and the talk turns to a decision that would be before the board, deciding or recommending or an issue that you would be providing direction to the city council on, and you start talking about that, or somebody else comes up to you and starts talking about it, and a group that's a quorum starts discussing it, it could result in a meeting. There have been a few situations in the state of Minnesota where that has resulted. So be careful of that. But the point is, the last point on this slide, avoid any discussions with other commissioners that are outside your meetings. That's the safest thing we can tell you to do. And if you do that, you'll be in a very safe category. As I said, meetings must be open to the public. Generally, and this is again generally, meetings must be within the city limits. There are times we can allow that to occur elsewhere, and we have done that, but we have to take special notice requirements to do it. So most of your meetings will be within the city limits. It has to be an accessible room for all public to participate in some fashion. That's not always a perfect thing, and the city works hard to do that. But staff has really worked to get an accessible meeting room for folks to meet in. The public, and again, in their participation, may not participate in general discussions that you're having, but they must be able to follow along, which really means they must have the agenda and any materials that you're dealing with, unless for some reason under data practices laws that data or the information is protected. But in most circumstances, for most of the commissions that are on the Zoom call tonight, you won't be dealing with protected data, so it will all be public data. Next slide, Dave. Again, one item is meetings that are generally open and should be open. They can be closed for certain circumstances. Rarely will that ever, if ever, affect any of you folks. It maybe would with the HRA, the EDA, and particularly the City Council, but any of your bodies typically know that won't be the case. You know, on down from the Charter Commission through the Environmental Board, that will not occur. Next slide, Dave. Now to kind of the issues where you can run afoul of the open meeting law in situations that might arise. Most of the situations that have arisen for other communities and even Faribault have been involving social media type contacts or email exchanges that occur between board members. And what I mean by that is you can have a circular meeting or a meeting of you folks if, and again, as simple as this happening, Dave or Deanna or Paul sends out an agenda item for whatever board you're involved with, and somehow a discussion starts resulting that's via email. That will be constituting a meeting violation because it will not be noticed. Public won't have an opportunity, but you will be exchanging information via email. So the one thing I want you never to do is hit reply all, only direct your communication to city staff. And if you do that, you'll again be in the safe category for this type of issue. A similar type of situation, and again, involving emails or responses or submittals to something like Google Docs or another platform like that, since there's many of them out there, even if it was Facebook, if you start getting a communication change going there with a number of board members, and again, constituting a level of a quorum, you will particularly run afoul of the open meeting law. So again, it's discouraged to have any type of response or email submittals to these types of platforms, including Facebook. That really is not something that as a board member, you should be discussing board business on. Doesn't mean you have to eliminate your own personal type discussions and Facebook pages and things like that. It's when we get to a situation of communications between board members. So that's the third point here. And the fourth point is really where I think people, when you look at it in this context, if there's a reason you're trying to do this to evade public discussion, there's no question it's going to raise an issue. Now, that rarely comes up. Where this generally comes up is a mistake. Somebody hits a reply all, somebody starts a discussion, and next thing they know, there's 3 or 4 board members, constituting a quorum, talking with a citizen in the community. So it's a mistaken type situation, not as specific or intentional. Unfortunately, it still is the same type of violation. It does not have to be intentional. It just has to be the fact that we have an open meeting that's occurring that's not supposed to do that. So again, general rules, avoid any discussions outside the public meeting with other board members. And if you have questions, direct them to your staff liaison and work through that process. That would be the safest, most convenient way to do it. Next slide, Dave. The next topic, and I touched on it just very briefly. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you mind, can we just pause for a moment and see if there's some questions on open meeting laws or some examples? Is that all right?
Sure.
So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for just a minute. And then if we can go back, and if you want to, put in a chat box or put somewhere or just unmute yourself and ask some questions on any of this, Google Docs, open meetings, any of that, I'd love to hear questions and have Scott respond. Any questions at all?
Scott, if I could.
Yeah, Chuck, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just throw this example up. When you were talking about having multiple people like on an email chain, I get that once you start involving the majority or board of commission. But I'm assuming this is still acceptable that if, let's say you've got a 7-member board commission, and when the meeting's over, you know, member 1 and member 2 just talk after the meeting and go, oh yeah, that was really tough. And, you know, and just those 2 members talk and it's a closed loop. They're not talking to anybody else and it doesn't constitute at any point that there's a majority. That's still fine, correct?
For everybody else, it's fine except for you, Chuck. I'll say no for you, but
I'm sorry to hear that.
No, I'm just kidding. The bottom line is you're correct. That isn't a violation. The problem which comes about is if, you know, A goes to B, then B goes to C, and suddenly C talks to D, you can have that chain or circular thing going where you have a problem. But no, I mean, the general discussion after, before, whatever, no, but it's always going to be that tenuous to make sure you don't have that chain connecting to any other quorum member.
And Scott, that's why I asked the question that way, that if it's a closed loop between 2 members, that's fine. It's when that daisy chain effect starts happening, and at some point you hit a critical mass, then you've accidentally stepped into the problem.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly true. Let's see, Roger's got a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking kind of pragmatically, when you have a commission of 7 people or however many people, when are you supposed to have a discussion? Because, you know, pragmatically speaking, you know, we want to limit our meetings to an hour. Well, we have a full agenda, we gallop through it, and basically we just sit there and go, We get through the hour, we're up. And if we go through, are we supposed to play the game of telephone that we're pestering the staff all the time and say, well, you know, could you tell the other members, you know, such and such, or ask them what they think, or get a comment from them or something like that when you're discussing, not making decisions? Is there a line there where, you know, you can have some kind of sidebar discussions, but you're not making decisions?
Well, if you do what Chuck said and keep it tied only to individuals, you know, and again, a 2 connected individuals rather than 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be, then I think it's fine. But the comment still stands from one of the earlier slides that any discussion should occur at your board meeting level. I know that's not perfect, but that is the only safe answer that I can really give you. Should you be having conversations with, you know, okay, again, if you have 8 members, 9 members on a board, and you connect with 5 of those members, you've had an open meeting violation potentially. That's what could happen. That can happen via email, it could happen via calls. That's why I say, yeah, you work through the staff liaison. I don't have a better answer for you, Roger, other than to say that the meeting should be where that discussion occurs. I've had former clients, former city clients, and Chuck and Dave and Deanna probably know one of the ones I'm talking about, that it was clear they were talking outside, and it was clear that 3 of them were talking outside that meeting. And when they got there, the other 2 didn't have an idea, the other 3 did, and they made decisions, and they had some violations that came out of that. And this is going back 10 years or so in another community. It's not favorable, but it's pretty obvious when the discussions have occurred outside, and that's where you'll see citizens complain. I mean, an honest truth, it really comes across very quickly that there's been a discussion that's occurred outside the meeting. So again, safest, you know, discussion point is lengthen the meeting, or make sure you get to say your piece at that meeting you're at for whatever board discussion you're having. That's the better.
Right. And it seems to me that maybe in the era of things like Google Doc or any of these platforms, you know, there's a click on there where you make it public, and anybody and everybody, you know, you can make it so anybody in the world can comment on it. Yeah. Maybe you set it so they can't edit it, but they could comment, and with that, and you can see what comments anybody has made because they're documented.
Yeah.
But
that's possible.
Hasn't been explored yet.
Yeah, you're right. That's possible. And clearly for the last, well, I'd say, 13, 14 months, there have been a number of communities, including Faribault, that have conducted a number of Zoom type meetings like this. And they are correctly done. They're correctly noticed. We can do that. We don't have to have the public meeting room open for that purpose. It's all done via Zoom or, GoToMeetings, whatever the source may be. But the reality is, those can only happen in certain circumstances. The legislature this last round, because of the COVID situation, did loosen that a little bit. But once the emergency declarations go away, whether on the state level or our local level through the city council, we lose a lot of our ability to continue with these types of meetings for boards. And just keep that in mind. That's going to go away. I don't know that that's a great way to do it because people have gotten used to it. And I think these meetings work fairly well for a lot of folks. But the reality is, when that declaration goes away on the state and local level, you will be likely having in-person meetings again because it'll be hard to do those over Zoom or GoToMeetings. They just will be. So your idea of saying using Google Docs and having them in a public forum, that makes sense. But the way the law is right now, it hasn't kept up with that, so it doesn't work at this point. It simply doesn't. And I do think the legislature has looked at it. They don't really have any good bills right now before them for expanding that at this point in time, but that's certainly something we could talk to our local legislators to do.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, if I may.
Yes.
First of all, I apologize. I was having problems getting logged on tonight, so I'm a little late. But in my history of chairing meetings, the one thing that I have found is, if a meeting is done and there seems to still be questions out there that truly didn't get answered during the meeting, what I have found is city staff does a great job. And I've reached out to city staff and said, at our next meeting, we need to talk about this, and put it in their laps to be able to make sure that there's clarification on something so that that conversation doesn't continue to spread.
That's a great point, Dave. I agree. That happens all the time. It happens at the end of the council meeting, kind of with the comments of upcoming matters. And I think that does happen at some of your board meetings as well, as what do we have on the next agenda, or 2 months down the road. I think that's great when you bring it up there and let staff know, or staff can let you know vice versa, that that's what you're going to be dealing with. The problem becomes is when you start having a discussion on that actual subject matter and another topic becomes part of the meeting. If you've already set the agenda, you get to the end of the meeting and suddenly you're going to have a 20-minute conversation on an application that's not yet come in, or a project that's not yet come in, but people have comments. I'm going to tell you, as your city attorney, tell staff to put that on the next meeting, like Dave said, and discuss it at that point and be safe so you don't get a complaint from somebody. It's kind of this extraneous or extra discussion that occurs at the end of meetings. A lot of agenda topics, and even the councils have this on their kind of, council comments or upcoming topics. They can get expanded well beyond what they should be. So be aware of that, and staff will try to keep you on task. There have been only a few times with the council I've had to say, hey, no, let's leave this to the next time, because staff usually gets there before I even have to say anything. So,
well, and it's easy with planning and zoning because we get done with our meeting and then we go into a workshop after that, which, we're no longer live on the air, but it gets awfully easy, and we've slid into it a couple of times, and where somebody starts talking about something that we voted on or something that came up in the meeting, and we're in our workshop, and that's where we have to say, we can't talk about that, we need to move on. And
yeah, no, exactly. That is the exact case of where staff hopefully can cut you off, or the chair will cut it off and say, nope, next meeting, let's go on. So, okay. Any other questions? Carl? Carl, you're on mute still. There we go.
Thank you. Well, I have a question on the chain effect. So I'm on a 7-member board, and if I call one of the other board members and maybe I have an exact question, or we talk about things at the meeting, and then that's it. And then after that, the person that I talk to talks to another chair, another person on the board, and then that happens again. There's not been any feedback to me, but there has, you know, there have been 3 phone calls.
Right.
And you're saying that's problematic?
I am. It's kind of what Chuck described as the daisy chain of a continuing on, and you get these connected points that are out there. It really isn't so much a decision, it's the exchange or receipt of information. And that clearly when you're having the conversation, you're exchanging a thought or receiving somebody else's thought at that point in time. That's where it results in the open meeting. It doesn't have to result in a decision or even a direction. It really is just the connectivity of the discussion that's occurring that you can result in an open meeting violation. Yes. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make any sense at all. I think you need to be able to talk to each other in the month in between. I can understand it if there was connection in emails or phones back and forth.
Yeah.
But if I'm making a call to one person or 2 person and we're talking about some things we're considering, I don't know, that seems a little edgy to me.
No, I understand. I think that was Roger's point a little bit too when we were talking earlier. The bottom line is the state has found, and there have been cases that state that can result in a meeting. I won't say that it always will, but why I'm telling you to avoid it is because it has, and you can result in liability because of that. So I don't make the rules. I only tell you what they are, in all honesty. Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Lola. This is my first time doing a Zoom meeting on a phone, so bear with me as I plow through this. I have 2 comments. I'm kind of familiar with the open meeting law, and I just wanted to go back to a previous comment where they said their work sessions are no longer public. Those need to be public because you have a quorum in the room. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I don't think that's what, maybe that's how it came across, but the reality is they're no longer being videoed or they're no longer live video, I think what the comment was. But no, absolutely a work session is a public meeting and you have to continue with that. No question about it. Yes.
And then also to kind of clarify, when you go from person to have a discussion, even though you're not in a room, like Monday I talked to so-and-so, Tuesday I talked to another one, that's actually called a serial meeting, and that is against the open meeting law.
Yes.
And if I can try to explain this, like if there's a commission that's making a decision and you want to have discussions the month before your meeting starts, I have a right to know what those discussions are as a member of the public. And that's why all of those discussions are to take place at a public meeting. And yes, meetings can get long, and that's why you follow your agenda.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
Well, no, I agree 100%. And that is the whole basis for the open meeting, the kind of open sunshine laws that came into existence back in the 1970s. They've been refined since that time, but the reality is the courts have said very clearly, and so has the legislature, that all those decisions, including what makes up the basis for that decision, any conversations that you have, are supposed to be open to the public. So that's correct.
And Scott, this is Dave. If I could just follow up on that a little bit. Let's say you are at a work session and you don't have something listed on the agenda, and someone brings up a topic. What are your thoughts on that? And if there starts to be some discussion about that, clearly no decisions made, but discussion about it, and it was not on the agenda.
Yeah, and again, that's where I think in most cases, each board has its ability to set its own agenda, but once it is set, if that comes up during the discussion point, after the setting of that agenda, that's problematic. There are also folks that will argue that that posted agenda is the only thing you can follow. That isn't where the courts have gone on that situation. They have, though, when it's a special meeting. So if you've got a regular meeting schedule, you can always state that our agenda will not be final till it's adopted by the board. But if you have a special meeting for one topic, two topics, whatever it may be, and again, whether it's the Historic Commission looking at this application for that building, there is to be no other discussion beyond that point. None, zero. And the courts have been very clear on that type of situation. Adding to a regular agenda may be possible at the beginning, but I would strongly discourage that you don't get off topic. And again, that's one that gets deferred to staff to bring back to the next meeting.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question on this. If it isn't a decision being made or it isn't a topic necessarily, but if a member of a board or commission knows of a webinar or they know of a special event and they send out an email to everyone on the commission, is that a concern? They're not asking for feedback. They're just saying, I want you to know about this topic.
You're starting to really split hairs, and the advice I've seen is consistent with what the League of Minnesota Cities does as well. Work through your staff. Work through your staff. If you have something to share, share it through your city staff member, your staff liaison. There you have no issue whatsoever. I'd find it hard to believe that somebody would complain about a webinar shared between board members saying, hey, this would be a good opportunity for education, go look at it. But if staff knows that's occurring, and there's some interactivity to it that people are answering questions or surveys during that seminar, I would tell you to post it as a possible quorum. If we know there's going to be people there, then there's absolutely no way you can have a complaint about a meeting violation at that point in time. I would prefer you work through staff, Dave, on a situation like that. There's no way you can run afoul of the law if that's what you do.
Okay,
absolutely
thank you.
Yep. But
what about sharing an article from the Daily News with other members of the commission?
Yeah, it gets to any sharing of information or receiving of information can result in that situation. Cindy, to your point, I would say, give it to, whoever's your liaison, give it to them or say, hey, please share this with the rest of the board. That would be the best way to get that information out. Roger, you had one too?
Yeah, well, I would just, it's along the same line. Then how does that look? I mean, because people, you find out stuff all the day, every day about webinars that you think, man, it's on urban trees that they did in Pennsylvania or something like that. And it'd really be cool for those who want to watch it. I can send it out, email to everybody. I send it to Dave, and then is it going to eat up all of his day dealing with all of us that say, oh, this is cool. Can you share it with everybody? Or could there be a public forum, sort of like Facebook or the webpage? Anybody can go to that if you open it up. And this is our public space. If you want to see what we're doing, go there and look.
I'm always going to tell you, Roger, where the law is right now, I tell you to share it with your staff member and send it out that way. I know you can't run into a situation that'll run afoul of the law at this point in time, but the law isn't perfect either. I acknowledge that. It doesn't take into reality a lot of times. We all have our complaints about the legislature. But it really does not keep up with what the technology is. And we're a number of years behind that still. And it was very evident during the COVID situation that's what's out there right now. I will let staff comment on, if
I do have one question as well. This is Sunny when you're ready.
Okay. Go ahead. That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So this is Sunny speaking. I just had one quick question. In regards to the agenda itself, when it's posted, there's like the time of the meeting at the beginning where it starts. And then typically there's like, if there anything, like, is there any adjustments to the agenda? One person would say like, oh, I forgot, I wanted to add this topic. And sometimes that's fine if we all agree to add that topic to the agenda and then we carry on. Is that something that's still allowed, or is that something where the agenda is set and that's something that you have to follow what's been posted?
I don't think you have to follow exactly what's been posted unless it's what's called a special meeting. There are 3 different kinds of meetings: just your regular scheduled meeting where we have an agenda and ready for that. Special meetings, which are for a particular topic, that it wouldn't work in that situation, or a closed meeting either, or emergency as well, emergency or closed. But the reality is, from the standpoint of adding something to your regular agenda, no, I think that's going to be in the chair's discretion, as long as everybody's got the ability to comment on it. Now, if it were the city council and they were suddenly going to discuss a very hot topic that just went before the planning commission, and halfway through the meeting, somebody wanted to add it and the public weren't aware of it, including the applicant, my answer would be absolutely no. It really just does depend on kind of the content of it. And that's a judgment call you have to make. You always have the ability to adjust your agendas in the front end. Can you adjust them during the meeting? Sure. It's not the best way, but it's possible. I don't recommend it unless it's absolutely necessary. Does that answer it?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. I just had one thing, that's all. So thank you.
Yes.
I just have one more question on email. I was talking to somebody in a different county and or city, and he made the comment that they were required as commissioners or city council members to have an email address under the city, you know, like you'd have, I don't know, Faribault, whatever it is at the end, for a simple reason is that technically any email you write as a director or chair or whatever is could, if it's contested, they have, the city or whoever has the right to go through your personal email if you're using that. And I know when I worked for the federal government, that was kind of the rule of the day too, is you do business on government emails and you do personal business on your own. Is there anything like that?
You're absolutely correct. And that is probably 2 slides up on here that we were going to talk about.
Okay.
That. So okay. You're getting there, but you're 100% correct. Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Carl had another question, I think, on meetings.
We meet monthly, and every month our agenda includes a public comment or question item on the agenda. Most months nothing happens, but somebody can come and bring up something that, and it could be a lengthy discussion. If we were actually going to move on something that somebody brought up in the public content or public comment period, we'd have to go through the process of adding it to the agenda or the next month's agenda before we passed on it. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, technically you are. And that's why in most cases with the public comment, and I know the council says this at their meeting, they do not react. They usually just receive the information, direct it to staff, or whatever council member will deal with that and either respond outside the meeting or at the next meeting. So yes, that is the better way to do it. It's one way for whatever board you are to receive information and then let staff get it to you for the next meeting if it needs to have some decision point. That's not perfect. There are some cities that track, but suddenly meetings from a meeting become a 2 or 3 hour meeting if somebody's brought in a topic that a number of speakers want to discuss. It doesn't make it easy to deal with that topic. So no, I think you're better off receiving that information and dealing with it either next meeting or during that month's time with staff.
Thank you.
Yes.
Other questions on open meeting laws? We can come back to it, but why don't we go ahead, Scott, and move on to the data practices, and I'll start sharing the screen again.
And a lot, yeah, why don't you, Dave, share the screen if you would, please. Yes, and keep in mind, a lot of these topics that we talked about at the beginning, the data practices, open meetings, any meeting interactions, they all kind of blend together at some point, but they do have their unique categories, and one of those would be data practices. For the purposes of most of you board members, any data that you have, and what I mean by that, agendas, materials for decision matters, staff memos, emails, phone calls, voice messages, things like that, text messages, all constitute public data in some form. And in most cases, as I've got here on this slide, we as the city council, city staff, you as board members, anybody working for the city must maintain that data in some form based on what the statutes require us to do. Now, there are 3 general classifications: public, non-private, which is really more or less personnel type data, and then confidential, protected, non-public data. Most of you people, most of the board members that we're talking with, well, probably everybody on here is only going to be dealing with public data. Rarely will you get something outside of that category. I can think of a couple of commissions that may deal with some confidential data as to buildings and things like that. But the reality is most of the data you are dealing with is public. And if it's not, staff will let you know, and there's certain precautions we have to use under the statutes to deal with that. But keeping that in mind, what happens is, and this topic has already come up a couple times, any data you have on your personal device, your personal computer, is something that would have to be produced if somebody made a request. So if there was a request made for all discussions that occurred on such and such proposal before board of whatever, that data has to be produced. And essentially city staff has to have a way of being able to say, how do we keep that? How do we collate it? How do we control it? And as Roger raised, there are many cities that assign a email address that's specific to the city and ask that all city related business be done on that email address only, or on such phone number only. That doesn't work everywhere. And again, with the number of boards we have, I'm not sure we could assign that many email addresses to board members in the city. Maybe it's possible, I don't know. It isn't what has been done in Faribault to this point in time, but you have to keep in mind, if you are using your own device or your own email address, I would request that you somehow create a folder where all that email exchange, sharing of agendas from staff, information from staff get put. So you can point to it and say, if there's a request made, that if we go to Roger and Roger, we need your data off your device, your computer, your phone, whatever, because Jane Doe has made a request for this type of data, that we can do it and easily do it. That would help staff out. That doesn't mean that that's going to be perfect, but at least it's a way to get there more expediently. Again, not perfect, but keep in mind that data is there. So if you have, an email exchange with somebody and it says that, we think the city attorney's an idiot, that's fine. But if you don't want that to become public, and it has to do with city business, and we don't like the advice the attorney's giving us or something like that, keep in mind that is something that would have to be produced if it's involving city business. So I guess what I'm saying is keep your comments professional as best you can. And I think all of you do. We've not had that issue at all in Faribault for some time. So, but keep that in mind. We have had at least one situation where we've had to try to get data off a private phone. I've had it in a couple other communities where it's resulted in some significant litigation between council members. So it does come up every once in a while when there's a bad political situation going on. Again, Faribault has not experienced that, and that's very fortunate. Dave, I think next one. I think I've got that. We covered on that one. The other item to be aware of on data practices relates to public data on appointed officials, which all of you are. Those 4 bullet points there are really what data the city can and possibly should have on any of you as you're serving as in your city capacity, because if somebody asks for it and the city has it, those are the 4 categories that we'd have to produce data. Now, I don't believe that the city has everybody's educational training or employment history. There's no reason for it in most cases. But if you have produced it and you've put it on one of the city's forms and somebody does ask for it, the city would be obligated to produce that. So keep that in mind. It goes for volunteer work, veteran status, any other governmental service. These are all things that the legislature has said should be public if, and again, only if the city has them on appointed officials in the city. And getting back to Roger's point, on the telephone and email issue, the bottom line is yes, you are required to have some telephone or email that's available. And I know for the boards, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, everybody's really using for the most purposes, their own email and telephones on this, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, that's potentially public data that can be produced. So keep that in mind. That's why I say try to bifurcate that from your own stuff as best you can, or create another Gmail account or something for your city work, if that's the case. Or let staff know that you know, Tim Murray and other folks that need to discuss and decide if we can get more email addresses for people in the city. Any questions on that? Any questions that you do have? And again, like I said, most of the data you have is public. There's not an issue we're going to have with it. But if you do have any questions, please let whoever your liaison know, and we'll talk about it. We'll figure it out for you. I think data practices usually is pretty straightforward for boards. So,
if there's no questions about that, I do want to, Deanna's, Kenan has had some issues with the internet, but just wanted to kind of mention the idea that if there are a lot of things on an agenda and it's getting too much, that, you know, one of the things is to manage that agenda, try to get it shortened and prioritize what can be accomplished within the time that the board or commission has. And also the mention, or just to reiterate again, which Scott, you have about the advisory capacity of a board and commission, that they're advisory to the city council. Right. So any other thoughts or questions about data practices? Otherwise we can move on to the next slide.
Move on. We'll go on to gift law then. Gift law and conflicts of interest. This is another category that I will say can bite some people. I don't think most of you are in a position that somebody will be trying to sway your decision by providing a very extensive gift, but honestly, it does happen at the city level, even to the extent of somebody offering you a meal or something along those lines. If you have an issue that's before you that you are making a decision to recommend to the council, or in the case of the planning commission, you know, actually making decisions, that can run afoul of the law. Both the statute and our city charter have provisions. It applies to both the elected officials, our city council, as well as anybody that's appointed to an official commission, which you all are. And it prohibits you from accepting any type of gift from somebody that's interested in whatever activity is coming before you. It doesn't always have to be a financial interest, but in most cases, that's where these situations arise. There are certain types of donations that the city can accept, but the reality is it goes to the city and not to you individually. And if anybody's trying to offer you something of any type of value, you need to let staff know immediately. They can result in a criminal action, so be very, very careful. Again, it rarely comes up. I've only encountered it a couple times in 26 years, 27 years now as an attorney, but it does come up, and you know, you don't want to be the one person that this comes up and bites you on that. There are exceptions. Dave, next slide, please. And those are something that are very insignificant type monetary value, something, you know, $5 or less, a sticker, a pen, you know, plaques or mementos, which the council does for commission members, something that's extremely unexceptional value. The legislature has not raised the $5 in decades, which makes little or no sense. But there was an argument back in the 1990s over, and it was an exceedingly long discussion at and debate at the legislature over a cup of coffee. And they decided to leave it at $5. So I'm telling you, don't go beyond a cup of coffee. So that's where the legislature got to this point, and that's what they did many years ago, and it has not changed. So I again, covered it very quickly. If anybody offers you anything, let staff know, and we'll let you know if it's okay or not. Next one is conflict of interest, which really dovetails, you know, well into the gift law situation. It really applies to all of us, again, commission and council members alike. The general rule is if you've got some interest, particularly a financial interest in a decision that's being made, not participate in the discussion for that matter. And in fact, I would recommend as your city attorney that if you are involved and you have an application, say you have somebody on a planning commission, they have an application before that planning commission, that they actually leave the room during that discussion. There is no way possible that you can be somehow regarded as providing undue influence or any kind of discussion. And even in those situations, my recommendation has been to those folks who have an application pending to not talk to staff about it. Have some intermediary, whether it's another person or an attorney or somebody else, make that direct contact. It's again, what the league recommends as well from an insurance standpoint. If you have an interest, do not discuss or become part of the discussion for that decision in any way, shape, or form. Little easier for you than the city council itself. HRA and EDA, as well as maybe the Planning Commission, have this on a little higher level. Even the Heritage Preservation Commission can as well when they're looking at buildings and things like that. But as long as you're not involving your own interest in that, you should be okay.
Scott, if you could expand on that a little bit. What a number of times I've heard, even if you don't have a conflict of interest technically, but it's perceived, it can be perceived as a conflict of interest. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And keep in mind, I just glossed over that in less than 5 minutes. And I have another PowerPoint that I was going to give to Dave that would last much longer than what we're doing tonight. And it can be very nuanced, but the bottom line is most of these conflicts where they arise are many times, I won't say most, many times they're really not a real conflict, they're more a perception. There's more an issue there that doesn't look or smell right. And even in those situations, you may not have a direct conflict, and we have run into that with particularly council members that I even say at that point, council members step back. It's probably a better way if in fact they can. If there's a number of them, and we've had a situation where there's been more than one involved in a street assessment project, something along those lines, they still, in that case, are allowed to vote. And we can come up with a way that allows them to vote, even though they may be interested in some form. So we may be able to find some exception around that, but perception is what the public will talk about. It's what the newspaper will write about. It's what the gossipers will talk about, and it'll be on Facebook, whatever it may be. And it may not be really a legal issue, but it really just doesn't look good. And so I would caution you to have your eyes wide open on that type of situation. And Dave's right, many times the perception is worse than the actual conflict itself. Now, Dave, does that cover it?
Yeah, so are there other questions before we move on to meeting procedures on gift laws, on conflicts of interest, anything along that line that people want to talk about, have answered?
Okay.
If not, we can move on.
The next few slides are kind of a hodgepodge of other items that are out there that Dave and I thought were probably worthwhile to touch on a little bit. One is the meeting procedure issue. Technically, the city has adopted Robert's Rules of Order. It's what, 1,300 pages long, the book I've got sitting here on the floor in my office. It is really something, and a couple of you have been very involved in this, Dave and Chuck, I'm thinking of you folks particularly, that when you're leading or chairing a commission, yeah, it's great to have that idea and be aware of it and understand what it is. But the bottom line is most times that Robert's Rules comes up is when you've got a problematic situation and people are talking over each other, things like that. Roberts provides a remedy or a way with rules of procedure that get you to the point of saying, you know, do we have an adequate motion before us? Who's got the floor to talk? Things like that. Again, there's all day seminars that attorneys and parliamentarians go to get trained on this. We almost never will get to that level, I'll be honest with you. Years and years ago, just as an aside, I did have one community that was very involved in Robert's Rules. They had 2 council members that wanted to follow every meeting very particularly that way. It essentially added to what would be an hour meeting, probably another 1.5 hours of time when you go through those steps. They kind of all got together, talked at a work session, figured it out, said they were going to kind of dispense with the very particulars of, extremely strict construction of it, and anything beyond, the motion, second, that type of thing. And their meeting suddenly became half the time, which, so I'll tell you, it can add a lot of time. It can help in certain circumstances. It has been helpful in meetings I've been at. But again, your typical process that you have, and you've sort of touched on it as we've gone through the meetings itself, is You show up at a meeting, you review the agenda, you approve that agenda, the minutes, you have your regular business of old and new. You may have public hearings depending on the type of board you are. You touch on future items, which we've already touched on and said, you know, how much discussion you have. You may say, you know, to your liaison, I want this on for the next meeting for the board to discuss. That's when you bring that up. You announce that and then you adjourn. And if you follow that procedure, you're 95% of the way with a successful meeting, in all honesty. You really are. I can certainly answer all kinds of questions you want on Robert's rules. They've come up, but Dave, why don't you go to the next slide where it talks about the role of the chair. But the bottom line, I'll tell you this, and I've said this to a number of councils over the years, there's a Supreme Court decision in Minnesota where it talks about how and when, you know, Robert's rules or a procedural order like this comes into play. The court in that case very clearly said they didn't care what rules you used. They didn't care how you got there. They only cared that it was a fair process, that people got to speak and discuss. So if there's, you know, Robert's rules itself is being used as a way to not let people participate, a court's going to look at that and frown on it. If you don't follow Robert's rules, but you fairly looked at it at a matter, made a decision and moved forward, the court's going to look at that and say, that's a very valid and very appropriate decision. Nice job, board and commissioners. So keep that in mind. It really is just a, whatever is fair, you can get through most meetings with that. And I won't even touch on the role of the chair here much, Dave. We can move on. It's the only time it comes up for a chair to have a problem is when you've got a very rambunctious crowd or a difficult issue. Again, rarely happens. It's only happened one time in Faribault that I'm aware of where you had to reach out and have folks there from law enforcement to make sure that the meeting went correctly. Any questions on that? Because I covered that quickly. I don't know that you need to have a lot of discussion on it. And Chuck, I'm sure could talk about it for hours, but I saw your hand go up. You have something, Chuck?
No, I was just twirling my pen, and I was also having a flashback to, yeah. I think this is my 30th year in city government in Faribault, and I can count on one hand the number of times I needed a guy with a badge in the room.
Yeah.
At Faribault, it's pretty rare, but in other cities, it's uniform. Every meeting that there's a uniformed officer in the meeting, you know, and Faribault's culture is just different. Same thing with some cities will have the attorney at every meeting and others don't.
Yeah, no, and again, whether it's necessary or not, you're exactly right. The council's got the feel for that. The board's got the feel for that. I will say, hearkening back to that one community, it wasn't just one officer, it was 3 officers at that meeting, just so you're aware of that. So it was a situation in a community that was not having a good time. So they're much better now. So they've worked it out, which is great. Next one, Dave, on social media.
Yep, so any other questions quick? All right, otherwise we'll share the screen here again.
And I was just trying to talk as fast as I could, everybody. If you want me to slow down, I will, but I see it's already 6:58, I think, and I was just trying to move. We've really already touched on a lot of these social media issues. I just wanted to remind you again, your own Facebook, your own Twitter is fine. Conducting city business via that's where the problem arises. That's the open meeting issue. That's the data issues that we've already talked about. But you know, you can connect with residents, you can share information with residents. The problem again is that quorum situation where you're sharing it with other board members. So keep that in mind. You can receive information from people, but if you do get that, it isn't a reply all to all your other board members. It would be to your staff members saying, Jane Smith provided me this information. I think it'd be great to share it with all the other board members. Send it to your liaison, they send it out. That's the best way to get that information distributed to everybody before a meeting. And again, we have obviously a city website where there's a number of interactions occurring on that. Staff has a fairly good handling of that. There's also a policy regarding that, and the city does also have a social media policy, which is applicable to everybody. And we can get that out to everybody. I think it might even be on the city website, if I'm not mistaken. But any questions on that, on use? And then Dave, why don't you go to the next slide where we talk about the uses? And I kind of already have touched on most of this as we've already walked through it in previous slides. But it can lead to situations where we violate the law, both open meeting and data. There always is the issue of etiquette. Faribault's been very good about that. Again, some other communities are not. There are some very I'll call it vicious comments going back and forth toward whether it's board members or council members. So be aware of that. It can happen. It's unfortunate, but I don't think we've had that much in Faribault, which has been great. Like I said, we have a city policy. That is something staff is very aware of, can help you with, and your liaison will help you with that very much so. So keep that in mind if you have questions. You certainly have your ability to express your own opinions on your own site, but keep in mind, as I said before, you are ambassador of the city once you're appointed. You do represent the city. The question is, do you suddenly now have a perception that you're wearing your city hat when you're doing that? That's why I say be careful with what you do. And a lot of times that can happen through letters to the editor, Twitter comments, Facebook comments, things like that. And that was the last topic we had. And I certainly can go deeper into that, but I know we touched on that throughout our throughout the past hour here, but I certainly will answer any other questions you have. If I didn't cover something you wanted covered, please let me know. I'll try to answer it for you.
Thoughts or questions from anyone on any topic?
And our last slide was, or last two slides, the one was that you should contact your liaison at any time with questions. Usually it's not a direct call to me, but sometimes that does result, or staff will have me give you a call. So keep that in mind. And then I wanted to, and Dave wanted to, and so did Deanna and Paul, who are on the call as well. Thank you for your service in Faribault. It is.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.
And thank you, Scott.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Now you got me thinking.
That's good.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Good night.